started on this live webinar from AISC Studios in Chicago, Illinois. It's the Structural Stability Game Show. Let's meet our contestants. Hailing from Atlanta, Georgia, he's one heck of a failure. Analyst. When not reverse engineering a building collapse, he enjoys reading, hiking, and spending time with his family. Before opting for a more stable profession, he was vying to be an Olympic figure skater, eventually retiring to give the other athletes a fair chance. Currently a managing engineer with Exponent, everyone please welcome Cliff Bishop. Our next contestant is coming to us from Austin, that unique Texas city home to world-class barbecue and breakfast tacos. She's been known to hug steel columns while sampling beers at the local brew pub. Currently an assistant professor of structural engineering at the University of Texas, it's Trisha Clayton. Our next contestant is also from Austin, but born here in Sweet Home, Chicago. Once a young right-hander with a wicked sidearm 96-mile-per-hour fastball, now he's better known for hurling jabs at architects and contractors who don't follow the AISC Code of Standard Practice on their structural steel projects. From Walter P. Moore, please welcome Larry Griffiths. Our next contestant joins us from Seattle, Washington. He's the earthquake guy. He's an avid runner, expert hype man, a sucker for a good sunset, and one of Diet Coke's biggest fans. A senior principal with MKA and their director of earthquake engineering. Everyone, please welcome John Hooper. And now for the host of today's show. While at university in the early 80s, our host was the lead guitarist in the punk band Instability. Unfortunately, around 1986, he developed a severe addiction to LRFD and was forced to leave the band. Unable to shake the habit, he put it to use by pursuing a career in teaching steel design. Currently a structural engineering professor at Buckling, check that, Bucknell University. Please welcome Ron Zemian. Ladies and gentlemen, Ron Zemian. Take it away, Ron.
All righty, folks. Thank you very much for that kind introductions. Very interesting. Everyone, happy Steel Day. This is going to be a lot of fun. We've got a bunch of contestants here, all up for the challenge. Let me just check in with each one and say hello. Make sure you guys unmute yourselves. Cliff, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Ron. Happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
You bet. Trisha, what's going on there, Professor? How are things?
Yeah, things are going great. It's Steel Day. I can't think of a better day to do this.
Absolutely. Larry, talk to me. What's going on, buddy?
I am present, excited about this game show, and very stable.
Very good. Well, I guess that does it for it. Whoa, sorry.
Wait, Ron.
Whoa, so sorry. John Hooper. Yeah, that's who that is. The earthquake guy. John, how are you?
Doing great. Trying not to rust in the rain here in Seattle.
Very good. All righty, folks. Well, we're in for a great show. Let me explain how things are going to work here. Basically, what you're going to see during the next 45 minutes or so are 3 case studies. I'll present the case studies. After I'm done, and it won't take too long for me to do that, we'll go to each one of the contestants. The contestants will check in with what they think was the controlling mode of failure. Now, I want to emphasize here, the contestants are not making up anything. Each one of their 4 opinions are realistic possibilities for what this failure, how this failure could have occurred. Once we're done with that, the contestants have checked in, then we're going to go to the audience. And we're very excited about this. The audience then is going to vote on what they think was the controlling failure mode. So in some part, they're voting to agree with one of the contestants. So we're going to be keeping track of how the audience does, as well as how the contestants do, as well as how the contestants do at convincing the audience. So it should be a fun show. I know I'm really looking forward to it. Once the contestants have checked in, the audience have checked in, then I will provide the actual roof failure, and then I'm going to turn it over to Cliff, and Cliff's going to go through the case study in more detail, and I'll take it from there and move on to the next case study. So I hope those instructions are clear, and let's get started with the first one. All right. So this is a serious one. I believe there were definitely injuries occurred, and there may have been life lost. But so as in every case in structural engineering, we realize we're designing for life and safety, and it just goes to drive home the point of how important the decisions we make during design and construction are. So let's get started. It was a solar power support structure. It's located in California, and essentially what's going on here is we've got a tube of water, and that tube of water is going to be suspended, or was suspended, from a set of frame towers. That tube of water then is well above the ground, and it's just well above a ground-mounted solar reflectors. Now these solar reflectors are in the form of some type of a parabolic dish, so when the sun rays hit them, they're all focused on that tube of water. Once that tube of water gets hot enough, it starts to boil, and it generates some steam, and of course that steam can then be converted to power, and off we go. It's important to note as I show this case study that there were three similar rows that had already been constructed, and they were working on one of the final rows when the incident occurred. All right, so letting your eyes adjust to this photo, this is just sort of a schematic of one of the frames. As you can see, they're very tall and quite slender. All right, they are constructed of tubular sections, and we've got them because they had to be delivered to the site. The whole structure is 57 feet tall, 28 feet wide, and to get them to the site, they had to come in parts. So we've got a lower leg. That lower leg is then attached to an upper leg. The upper leg then has a receiver unit sitting on it. That's where that tube is. And above that is a lifting weldment that's used to place the structures. So that's generally the setup. Just a quick overview of the erection process. Each one of the frames were put in place. As you can see, they're all lying on the ground there. Once all the frames have been constructed, then it's time to erect them, and basically what happens is a crane lifts them vertical. Once they're vertical, they're tied to the ground, and then using a chain and winch process, the tube is then lifted up into the location where it's going to finally sit. As you can imagine, and why we're looking at this failure, things didn't go well. So part way up, they're lifting the tube here. You can see the tube. It's just below the height between the lower and upper legs there at that connection. They're lifting the tube. There's no water in it, but certainly the weight of the tube, and suddenly, as you can see, the frames buckled. All right. Upon closer inspection, there were a bunch of weld failures, and I believe, yeah, there you go. You can see one of those pictures there showing the weld failures right at the intersection, and so that's, of course, you got some column buckling occurring, and right at that intersection, sure enough, we broke a weld. All right, so that's the background that I'm going to give each one of you. And at this point, what I'd like to do is check in with each one of the contestants. And based on the very brief amount of information I've told you, but I think there's certainly enough there, I'd like you to check in. So, John, you're up first. What do you think was the root cause of the failure?
Well, yeah, real quick, Ron, being the earthquake guy, I'd like to blame it on an earthquake ground shaking. That didn't happen. But if you remind everyone about the previous slide, that weld failure was the cause. It wasn't a big enough fillet. It was poorly placed potentially, and it snapped right between the upper and lower leg. So fundamentally, the cause of the failure is that weld you see on the screen.
Yeah, that's certainly a heavy weld failure there, John. We can see in that picture. Well, thank you for that, John. So let's see. We're going to check in with John there, indicating a weld failure. The professor is up next. Tricia, what are you thinking?
All right, when I first saw that photo of that tower, the first thing that jumped out at me is those spindly little spaghetti sticks that they call legs. These just looked tiny, probably inadequately designed. You know, perhaps the engineer made some inappropriate assumptions when checking the buckling load of those legs. You know, an easy place to go wrong is those idealizations we often make for the boundary conditions. Maybe they assumed the bottom was fixed when there actually was some rotation there, or maybe they assumed the top had the translation fixed and actually it could displace a little, but I think there was probably an inadequate design to those legs of the frame.
All right, so you think it was in trouble from the beginning. All right,
yeah.
Thank you, Tricia. All right, Cliff, what's your thinking?
Thanks, Ron. I think that this is related to poor construction sequencing. I think the engineer probably got this right. It's pretty hard to screw up the capacity checks, and I think the weld was fine. Looks like a pretty beefy weld to me. I think it was just erected out of sequence. In other words, the contractor lifted the weldment or lifted the A-frame assembly into place and didn't brace the top of it before he started lifting the pipes. And, you know, when you have a 57-foot tall flagpole on spindly little legs, as Tricia said, I think you would be expecting a failure that we saw.
All right. So, yeah, definitely out of plane on that frame. It was quite slender. So I see what you're saying there, that poor construction sequencing would certainly be a possibility. So, all right, that's 3. Larry, number 4 here. What's your thinking?
Yeah, Ron, being a good wind engineer, as I take a look at this site, it's pretty apparent to me, we're in California where the Santa Ana winds are blowing, and we're also in a very open site. So it looks to me like what could have happened here is we had a wind blowing longitudinally down the line of these towers, and being very slender, round HSS sections, it looks like we had a vortex shedding phenomenon going on here. And we started a vibration in this environment where we had a slow but steady wind that induces vortex shedding vibration. And so I'm going to go with the idea that we could be looking at a vortex shedding wind phenomenon failure here.
All right, so well, that is definitely complicated, but could certainly make sense. Extreme weather could have been driving this. All right, well, as I indicated before, first, thanks to contestants for their thoughts, and all 4 of these certainly a realistic possibility. I'm now going to switch over to the audience and see what the audience thinks. And so we're going to do a quick poll. And so be sure to vote which one you think. Was it A, a weld failure, B, inadequate design, C, poor construction sequencing, or D, extreme weather? All right, let's start the poll, shall we, Nate?
So Larry, it's always wind about you, right? You think it's a vortex shedding. Are you sure about that?
John, what I do know, it's not an earthquake phenomenon.
Well, I readily admit that up front, but I'm not sure about the wind. We'll have to wait and see what the audience thinks.
I know you're an earthquake guy, but, you know, from a wind perspective, there's a real possibility here.
Yeah. It's definitely a slender system, so quite interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, Cliff's got my interest peaked there with that bracing. So, all right, let's see how we did here. Ooh, very interesting. We had about 12% of the audience check in on a weld failure. About 31% came in with with an inadequate design. And looking down a little bit further, poor construction sequencing was received the most votes, but still only about 50% of the audience. And Larry, sorry to report, but you only grabbed about 6% there on those agreeing with you that it could be extreme weather. So I think you've had a chance to think about it. Contestants, I want to let you know the correct solution is sort of a shared one between the professor coming in with inadequate design and Cliff coming in with poor construction sequencing. So it was really a combination of those two that took this system down. So I'm going to turn it over to Cliff. Cliff, please take a few minutes, 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, and just go through with us what you all found upon a more thorough investigation. So Cliff, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Ron. So let's start with what it wasn't, and that's the weld. And so how did we go about exploring this? Well, the nature of the way the system was constructed gave us some real insight into the weld. And so as Ron mentioned, the system, and as you saw in one of the photos, the system was actually constructed on the ground. The pieces were fit up on the ground. And then the crane came and lifted the top of the weldment, the upper weldment, and lifted the crane lifted the tower vertically. And so when that process of lifting, the tower legs are subject to their own self-weight, right? They're resting on the ground, and they have the crane picking at the other end. So you have essentially a simply supported like structure that's bending. And the moment that is developed across those welds, the maximum moment is 95 kip inches. And so, again, that just kind of sets the idea of what type of forces we were seeing in these elements. So next we said, all right, well, let's look at what's really going on here. So if you want to, if you can't test it, the next thing we do is take it to finite element land. And so we ended up modeling this connection here. And what we did is we then subjected that connection to a movement, or basically a displacement at the top. And what you're seeing here is, in the middle picture, is you're actually seeing the stresses across the section. Anything in blue has not quite reached yield yet, and anything in white or gray, that's a gray, is fully plastified. And the last figure on the right is just a profile view to show you that, and I can tell you that the overall geometry that we see here matched with the actual plate that we recovered from the site. So using those two pieces of information, we put together this slide. And so what we're seeing here is 4 different bars, and I'll just talk about this briefly. The weld design is the load that was to be on the welds when this system was in use, so when it's operating and has the water in the tubes. And so we just normalized that to 1.0. The weld capacity, based off of the measurements and our finite element analysis as well, corroborate we had about 9 times the capacity there. The tower tilt-up actually put almost 6 times the demand on it than the weld design itself, or than the tower was supposed to be operated under. And then lastly, the receiver load just prior to buckling was somewhere around 1/4 of the design. So ultimately, the welds were sufficient, and the damage we saw was related to the broken welds that we saw were related to large displacements associated with the collapse of the structure. In other words, the structure came down and then the welds broke, and not the other way around. One other, again, we also checked the design. And so in this case, we said, all right, the system was not braced at the top, right? These are just freestanding towers. And so we performed an analysis of the system, and we varied the out of plumbness of the tower, as you might do in your designs, with an out of straightness between the top and the bottom, assumed as L over 1,000. And as you might expect, this plot doesn't really tell you anything too exciting. It's that the more the tower is out of plumb, right, for the same level of force, you're going to get more displacement at the top. So this is kind of something we expected, but we needed to kind of show how these plots varied for for an unknown amount of initial imperfection. And so, again, the design was pretty adequate. If we just looked at 3 models, a self-weight only model that was unbraced at the top, we calculated, buckling load of 17.8 kips. The case 2 is the receiver is being lifted plus the self-weight of the tower is considered. For an unbraced is about 6.1. And the receiver plus the self-weight, if it's braced at the top, is around 30 kips. And you'll see the weight of the tower plus the receiver is about 6.9. So essentially, case 2 never stood a chance, right? And when you started lifting the receiver, you couldn't get this to work. So what does that mean? Well, it's an adequate design, right? We think. The designer's CD and calcs included things like the analysis of the braced structure for lifting. So that means the engineer considered that the top of the tower was going to be braced during the lifting process. The only case that was considered unbraced was actually the case that Larry was talking about earlier, and that's the case of wind. So they considered it unbraced for wind. So, and in this, you might say, well, how did they get 3 of these built and the last one not built? Because the contractor said, we're delayed. Can we move along faster by not guying these towers, which they had done on the previous 3? And the engineer wrote back, yes, you can do that. So in this case, the engineer ultimately directed the contractor in the erection procedure. So essentially the engineer's fault. But then you might also say, well, the contractor did not consider the slenderness of the frame and double-check the engineer, right? Maybe the contractor should have second-guessed the engineer. So maybe it's the contractor's fault. I will just leave you on one parting thought. The engineer who signed off on this in the braced condition was a mechanical engineer, not a civil engineer. So maybe that'll make you feel a little better that you probably would have gotten the Euler buckling load check and would have noticed that this was going to fail before it happened. So, Ron, I guess I'm going to turn it back over to you for the next case.
Very good. Well, thank you for that thorough description of what happened. Certainly a very interesting failure. Let's move on. So the second case for our contestants here is a dome scaffolding collapse. First big mistake that they did with these tanks is they built them out of concrete. So, of course, being SteelDay, we wouldn't even be having this conversation if these big tanks were done out of steel, but so it goes. We've got 7 digester tanks, numbered from 17 to 23, so it makes me think there's a bunch more somewhere else. These are good-sized tanks, 125 feet in diameter. So what's that, about 40 yards? Half a football field. They're about 50 feet tall, good size, and the tanks are about a foot thick. So these are pretty hefty beasts. The base, a little bit difficult when you go to construct that roof system. So the base is slanted towards the inside, so circumferentially slanting towards the inside to bring all what's in there towards the middle to drain out or whatever's going on. To get that concrete roof system in place, they used a set of aluminum falsework that was used to support the formwork and do the deck pours up top. Tanks 17 and 18 had already been constructed. The roof decks had been poured, no incident. So again, similar to that previous case study where there's some successes in the bank, but still a failure occurred. Tank 19 was ready for a concrete deck pour, and tanks 20 and 21 had the falsework almost fully installed, but they weren't quite ready for the concrete. So we're going to focus on tank 19. Now, at the time of the accident, they were placing that concrete up on the top of the tank, provide a roof system to the tank. It was being placed moving north to south, so we're not going to do it circumferentially and move inward. It's one side all the way to the other. And about half of the concrete had been placed when the accident occurred. So always tough for structural engineers to see pictures like this. here it is, the system collapsing, and you just sadly see only a portion of the system supported, and then looking inside there, just horrible sighting of all that scaffolding collapsing and the like. So a messy picture, tough to look at. The failure, well, certainly the false work supporting was plywood, so that's what was holding everything up and dropped in. There were 29 people on that roof deck. 14 of them were injured, 4 very seriously, and thank goodness none fatally. Tanks 19, 20, and 21, right after that failure, were immediately put under a California OSHA order to preserve, which means everything stopped and nothing would continue until a thorough investigation was completed. I want to show you a little bit about that scaffolding. So we're looking inside now. The plywood formwork up on the top for that concrete was supported, the plywood was supported on top of aluminum beams. These aluminum beams were sort of layered on top of each other to get the loads over to the shoring towers, which were also made out of aluminum, and that's the system. If we have a look from the inside here at the shoring system, looking up at the top and down at the bottom were screw jacks, and these screw jacks were needed because, again, the inside tank was tilting inward. Let's see, what else I got for you? Many of the towers, by the time the screw jack was all the way up, it still could not reach the base of the aluminum beam, so they had to put in some substringers, and these substringers could be anywhere from 12 to 16 inches long, simply sitting on top of the screw jack and below and supporting the aluminum beams. Again, another picture of that very slender scaffolding system and those screw jacks down at the bottom, which, boy, they look mighty slender down there. And again, they needed the screw jacks because the floor is not level. This is, again, another tough picture to look at, but when you arrive at the site, this is what you saw. Frames fracturing, welds fracturing, couplers failing, substringers at the supports failing, substringer web buckling occurring for those substringers that didn't just fall in. We've even got some cross brace connections. They were either missing or had also failed. So, what was the cause of this failure? And that's why we've got these 4 contestants that are going to be working with us. And let's see, Larry, you're up first. Larry, what are you thinking on this one?
Well, Ron, I don't see any wind issues on this one. That's always my first thought. But what I do see is a lot of questionable details in this shoring system. And the fact that you mentioned that the planning on the height of some of the scaffolding wasn't the best, and there clearly was some last-minute decisions, and putting in this substringer at the top to extend the scaffolding really creates a highly questionable detail. And it sure looks like this one's a no-brainer in the sense that we got a case of web crippling here, or web buckling on these substringers, which clearly were an afterthought. So I'm going to go on this one with these top substringers being the source of this particular failure.
All right, Larry, thank you very much. So a stringer web buckling is where you're checking in. All right, Tricia, what are you thinking?
All right, Ron, do you mind going back to slide 36 for me?
36,
I had
1 second. All right, yes, there you go.
Yeah, I had the exact same feeling you had. When I saw those screw jacks extended, I thought, man, those are really slender, and they look, especially the ones closest to us, they look like they were extended really far, maybe too far. You couple that long unbraced lengths of those screw jacks at the base, with the fact that they're sitting on wood that's cut at an angle on a smooth concrete surface. So it looks like they're just prone to kick out. So I think it was buckling started here at these screw jacks, which were extended out too far.
All right, very good. So we got the screw jack extension buckling. Thank you very much, Tricia. John, what are you thinking?
Well, I think both Larry and Tricia have some pretty plausible explanations. They're really focused on what happens locally at the stringer and the screw jack. But if you go back, Ron, to slide number 36, if you would, for me, and look at the shoring towers. 36, yes. The shoring towers, the basic towers for which these little spindly things do sit. I do admit that. But you don't see any bracing between these shoring towers. They're spanning the entire floor, the height. And so I think they just miscalculated the unbraced length of each of the shoring towers. And each shoring tower needed to be braced in addition to what they don't have right now. And so it really was inadequate bracing of these shoring towers.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, John. Very interesting. Cliff, you're on board. What are you thinking, Cliff?
Thanks, Ron. I think it's simply a case, even bigger picture than John's. I think it's just too much concrete. The engineer didn't calculate this correctly. They started pouring the concrete. You got some deformations in the shoring tower system because the shoring towers are so high, as we've seen a few times in that slide 36. And so what happened is you started to get a deflection, and that required more concrete, and you put in more concrete, and then you got more load, and that gave more deflection, and then essentially just too much concrete, too much weight, system came down.
Very interesting, Cliff. Yeah, combining that with the fact that they didn't uniformly load up the entire system, as we saw, they went south to north to south to south to north. Very plausible. So there are four here that, I don't know. Let's see what the audience has to say. So we're going to jump over to the audience and ask them to check in. So what do you think, folks? Please vote. Was it stringer web buckling? B, screw jack extension? C, inadequate bracing of the shoring towers? Or D, there was just plain too much concrete up there and the system couldn't support it? Please start your voting.
Ron, being SteelDay, you'd think it would be just too much concrete, right? It just doesn't fit.
Yeah. I mean,
so, John, you didn't see any earthquake effects on this one?
No one noticed all of the extra concrete trucks showing up, and so, it's definitely the concrete.
Yeah, I think a lot of steel people would always have that expression, too much concrete.
you can have steel without concrete. You can have steel without concrete. You can't have concrete without steel. So there you go.
Okay. Yep. That's why we're celebrating Steel Day.
So, John, you didn't see any earthquake in this one, did you?
No, I thought about it. It's California, so that's plausible, but not this time. And there's certainly not wind.
Right.
The results are here.
The results are in, yes. Here's how things came forward. Stringer web buckling. Larry, your numbers are low again, only 8%. Tricia, the professor, has come through with their screw jack extensions. Inadequate bracing received a decent nod. So, John, you're getting on the scoreboard here a bit. And Cliff, they just weren't buying the too much concrete. So let's turn it over to you, Cliff, and have you walk us through what actually took place. The actual failure was indeed Larry on the scoreboard with stringer web buckling. So now we'll go to Cliff for give us some details on what happened. Cliff, you up for it?
I'm ready.
All right, please just take about a few minutes. All right, Cliff, we're running a little bit behind time.
Sure. So there were many different failure modes and contributions that we considered. So I won't read them all here, but including those long screw jacks and overloading of the tower legs and basically everything that we've said, we tried and investigated. And a couple of interesting thoughts here. The shoring system design. The maximum applied load per leg was 9,000 pounds, and the allowable load per leg was specified at 8,800. Well, based on the shoring system calculations and the setup that was used, there was a factor of safety of at least 2.5, and therefore the minimum capacity that we were expecting at ultimate per leg was 22,000 pounds. So we have something that had about 9,000 on it, was supposed to be about 22,000, or could have held up to 22,000, but wasn't able to do so. So the design drawing specified up to 9 tier towers with no outer frame bracing, and the 16-inch long substringers on top of the tower legs. So these are actually shown in some of the design drawings. However, the effect of those substringers on the load was never calculated. And so again, here the issue is that you have a sloped floor, right? And you have towers of set height, and so you essentially have to adjust the screw jacks and add these substringers where necessary to get the shoring towers to stay in place. So here's what I want to get at here in this slide is this is the design demand. So on the left side, the original design was about 9,000 pounds. There were other engineers working on this, and they calculated that the demand per leg was ranged from about 11,000 to 12,400, depending on the spacing and the substringers. And we had calculated again in that same range, that 11,000 to 14,000. It's actually the load on the leg. And so remember, again, we're comparing this to the 22,000 that we expect from the calculations. So the actual loads, that was the design. The actual loads that were on there were around 7,200, so a little bit less. And again, what we actually calculated for those capacities. So I know we've got to pick it up a little bit. So we actually conducted full-scale testing. We were incrementally loaded. This is actually a test setup we made, and we actually incrementally loaded these to failure. And essentially, the web buckling of the substringer is what led to a global collapse. The peak loads that we got on these legs were around 14,000, 13,000. And then the failure load significantly below the design level of 22,000. So let's do the video. I want to show you a video of our test. Okay, should be. And all the video is going to show is it's pretty boring until it happens. So just take a look at the video. I won't talk over it, but just to let you know that we're loading, and then we get a failure in the web stringers. Okay. All right. So we prepared a finite element of the system to check out the bracing that was used, and to kind of look at it from a finite element land. And again, we looked at all these different variables. And the main crux of the results is here, and showing that the design load, again, design allowable is 8,800. The minimum ultimate was around 22,000. And you can see here all the starting from the third from the left. All of these bars indicate different things that we looked at. And again, the screw jacks did have some effects. The no bracing in the outer frame did have some effect, but it's really the substringers that drove the bus on this. So that's the end of this one, and I'll turn it back over to Ron to start case 3.
Thanks a lot, Cliff. Yeah, that one always reminds me of you've got to be very careful whenever you run a wide flange section over the top of a column, and make sure that thing is properly secured and properly braced. So very interesting. Our last case study, and folks will need to move along fairly quickly through this one, but it's a building roof collapse. It was in an office building in suburban Oklahoma. There's a picture from the outside, and more difficult to see is the picture from the roof. What would happen is there was a severe rain event, and during or shortly after this severe rain event, the roof partially collapsed. And you can see the portion collapsing here. If you go inside, and this is another area not right at the collapse or right near the collapse, you can see some of the failure that has taken place. There is a screw jack that has been placed just temporarily to hold that open web steel joist up. It's important to see that the open web steel joist, at the joist seat, it has come off the header that was supporting it. So let me show you a picture here, how the design worked. We had an exterior facade. We had stud walls in place. We need something to support that open web steel joist. Unfortunately, it falls between the stud walls. So they provided a secondary system to support the truss. On the load from the truss is now bearing on top of that header, and then it will find its way left and right into that truss support system. So here is a photograph of that. Again, the joist seat meaning to sit on the entire set of back-to-back angles. Not quite clear whether it achieved that, but nevertheless, that was the goal. The load from the joist seat, from the entire truss, then needs to go left and right into those supporting columns that were prepared. A little more views from the inside. If you take a close look at the photo in the right, this is one that didn't come right down, but was about to. You can see quite a bit of crushing of that header. So the header, again, made out of cold form section that were angle channels that were faced toe to toe. All right, so with that brief overview, contestants, can you give me a quick check-in? How are things going? What are you seeing? Let's see. Let me check my records here. Tricia, you've been pretty convincing this far along. The audience tends to be agreeing with you a lot. What's your thinking on this one?
You know, I gotta say, this is probably not the structural engineer's fault. It was Oklahoma, rainy season. Yeah, I think that this is a case of, you know, maybe there were some drains clogged on the roof, big rainstorm came in, maybe there's scuppers on the side, didn't allow all that water out, so just the rain loads and the ponding was more than what was considered in design. So an overload on the roof due to the rainstorm.
Very interesting, Tricia. Thanks for that insight. Cliff, where are you going?
I think the support that was missing, the one drawing or slide you show, I think it was 61. There was supposed to be a support directly under the truss location or an additional stud. That was never installed. So again, you probably didn't calculate to have this little box header, I suppose you call it, in bending. It was supposed to just transfer the load directly down into the stud, but the stud wasn't there. So I think it's that missing support that caused it.
All right. Thank you, Cliff. John, you and Larry are struggling a bit here with points, so let's put one on the board, shall we?
I will try. It can't be the rain. Those roofs are designed for that, Tricia. No offense. You go to slide 62 real quick one more time, and you can see the box header. It is crushed like you had described. It's really just a matter of the local member effects, Ron and team, not designed to consider the web buckling and crippling. You can see it just squashing right there. So it really was an inadequate header, not taking account the web buckling and crippling effects. I'm sure of it.
All right, John, thank you very much. Larry, you're up. What are you thinking, Larry?
Well, I hate to say it, but I could agree with John here, but I think overall this is a pretty questionable design. I mean, it just shows you got to get the right engineer on the job. And clearly the guys that looked at this one didn't get all the design requirements checked, and so I think we should say overall this is just an improper design.
All right, Larry, so it just was never going to work. So again, 4 very plausible solutions. There is a root failure. I'll describe that, but first let's go to our audience, see what they're thinking. So one more time to take your poll. Please vote. What did you think was the root cause? A freak storm. The system was overloaded, and the structural engineer just had no chance. Missing support, so improper construction. local member effects. We basically crushed the web of that C-shape or C-shapes, depending if the load was actually in both of them. And then going into Larry with just an overall improper design, that's not the way to do it. So, folks, please check in and let me know what you've got.
So, John, no earthquake on this one, right?
Yeah, I thought you'd go with tornado. I really thought you would, since it's Oklahoma, but you didn't go there. So.
That one, I didn't see any effects of a tornado there, but I could have gone with the earthquake one though.
Oklahoma, they do earthquake. Yeah, they do.
Here are the results, folks. All right, we've got some results. Freak storm, only about 10% thinking that. Missing support, they weren't buying that one either. John Hooper with a big score here. Audience tending to agree. Local member effects. Yeah. Seeing that crushing. And then some combination of that. Larry, you did get some points, 25% there. Again, improper design could indicate that local member buckling was controlling. So, in effect, the correct answer was local member effects. John, you got a score there. Congratulations to the audience that agreed with them. And I have to say the improper design was fairly close. So let's jump over. Yeah, Cliff, anxious to take it at it. Give us a few minutes, Cliff, on what happened.
All right. Thank you, Ron. So as we said, this was a web crippling effect. And so this is kind of a mix. There was some other construction error, but it wasn't one of the choices we gave you. But instead of being a fully boxed header that was supposed to be installed at these locations, we ended up with two horizontal studs framing between the vertical components. And so therefore, the flexibility of the end connections, we were able to get web buckling a lot easier than we were before. All right, so a couple things, how we looked at this. We ignored the open section for the calculations right now. It's kind of an upper bound of our estimate, right? And then we went through and made some calculations. So the allowable load per the rain loading was supposed to be about 1.9 kips. We calculated a capacity of around 3.5. The non-factored loads, so the actual loads that were there, were around 4. So we did have a lot of water on the roof. The building officials, or BOCA, requires that at least it stands 2.5 times the live load when you test it. And the reason we checked this is because we were getting an expert report from other people working on the project that said that this couldn't have been web crippling because you had 7.4 kips of capacity. So interestingly enough, if you go to some look at the tests that were produced, the test indicated the capacity of the bearing assemblies was at least 7,500 pounds, which is sufficient to meet the building code. So that was the argument. Then later on, we got this table. And so you can see the capacity of 7429, although we have two tests which occurred at much lower values, which is kind of odd to me to report the highest and not the lowest value that you received, but that's what we had. And so furthermore, I think right before trial, we got some videos, and these are actually the failure modes of the three different cases that were tested. And what's interesting to note here is, especially in the middle photo, where is the web? The stud is completely crushed. And so, of course, if you continue to load in a test apparatus, if you look at the top right one, you continue to load and load and load, essentially your load point is just bearing on the additional studs below. And so what we saw was, what is this design strength? Well, web crippling occurred somewhere around here. But the reported strength was reported somewhere around here, simply meaning that, again, at some point, the trusses themselves were bearing on the studs directly. So, of course, you'd have a higher load at that point. And also, again, the reported strength occurs at this large displacement. And what does that mean? Well, that means that once the web crippling occurred, to get to this strength, you would have a lot of rotation, right? And that rotation would then allow the joist to essentially slip off the bearing, which is what we saw in this analysis. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ron to let him finish this up.
All right, Cliff, thank you very much. Yeah, that one is very interesting how that played out. Some closing remarks, of course, where do you go on SteelDay but all the way back to the father of stability, Leonard Euler? Since the fabric of the universe is most perfect and is the work of the most wise creator, nothing whatsoever takes place in the universe in which some relation of maximum and minimum does not appear. So we saw some maximums exceeding minimums, and down came the system. So I want to thank the audience for their participation. I'd also like to reach back to our contestants and just check in. Each of you fared well. Each of you got on the scoreboard correctly with a correct input. My last notes indicated that it was indeed the professor who was most convincing. And so, Tricia, congratulations on that. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Cliff Bishop at Exponent. Cliff, these were 3 great case studies, and very much appreciated that your firm was allowed you to share them with us, and thanks for putting those details together. We do plan to do a similar show at the upcoming NACC in Louisville, and we've got a whole new set of case studies coming from Jenny Elsner on that day. So I think at this point, I did receive a few questions. I see the time is about 55 minutes, so I think we're pretty close to staying on schedule. Cliff, question for you. The other contestants certainly have experienced this perhaps as well in their investigations, but in the first 2, there were situations in which other systems had already been built and survived, but then going on to another one, it failed. You did provide us some reasoning in the first one of they tried to cut some corners during erection, and it really bit them in the butt, not providing some temporary bracing. The question from the audience was, what happened in the second one? Those tanks, we've already got some tanks that came together and did not collapse with that shoring system. And doggone it all, you go to the third one, and sure enough, it came down. Any thoughts on why the first 2 were able to survive?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, and thanks, Ron. It's kind of interesting because we wrestle with that. And again, I think the first one was pretty direct, right? It was that the engineer, that the contractor was behind schedule, and they asked the engineer, and the engineer said, sure, go ahead. But really the second one, it was a little different, and I think it was just that the loads and the capacities, as best that we can calculate them with our engineering analysis and judgment, were just right on the cusp of being okay. And so you get, a shoring tower that's moved 1 foot in any direction. Maybe that's the impetus. Or you get a screw jack that's 3 inches longer. Or you have a web stringer that isn't positioned in the center at one place. And so essentially when your capacity is sitting right at your demand level, all you need is the butterfly flapping its wings in Madagascar to cause the whole system to come down. In other words, it was just waiting to happen, and why it made it through 2 and didn't make it through and happened on the third one is really anybody's guess. So I hope that's a reasonable answer.
No, certainly. They were. I guess what I'm hearing is they were just very lucky it didn't happen, but then unfortunately their luck ran out. So I heard a question, not really a question, but certainly one of the audience members on that first failure. It seemed the numbers bent way over. Boy, it was just an absolute clear illustration of the P-delta effect and what can go on. Larry, I know I've wrestled with you on this P-delta effect. Did you see all that bending up at the top before that thing came over? Any thoughts on the P-delta effect for today?
Yeah, no, the whole observation on that one is it looked like a fairly scary design, and I'm not sure an engineer with using all of his engineering judgment would have made everything quite as slender as we saw there. So the question is how much analysis was really done on that, and how accurate was that analysis in the original design?
Yeah, very difficult. I'm going to try to jump back a slide here. Let me see if I can find it. I believe what I want to have a look at are those stringers that were sitting on top of the columns there in the second one. Cliff, is there any chance we can go back and you can play that video again? We were a little rushed, and I think we've got a minute or two. Now we could just show it again. I'm going to try to bring it up for you as soon as I can find it. Yeah, here it is. So, Cliff, I'm going to see what happens here. All right. So go ahead and I can't see what you're seeing. Is the video playing?
Yes, Ron, it's ready to go.
All right. So go ahead and hit the go button there, Cliff, and let's watch this thing.
Yeah, so it should be playing now.
All right.
And so hopefully you've seen it now, but what you see there is actually a twisting and collapse of it. So basically the two flanges twisted relative to one another and then crushed the web in between them.
Oh, boy, so that one's even tougher. So, yeah, I mentioned the possibility of running an I shape across the top of a column. There it would be just web crushing. Here we had the crushing combined with the possibility it was short enough that it could actually twist. So, yeah, that was very interesting. We did get a nice shout out from one of our audience members. Where would the world be without steel? Very nice. And I think we'll end it on that. Nate, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And thanks to our contestants and audience. And happy Steel Day, everybody.